The sound of a gunshot at close range doesn't echo the way people think it does in the movies. It swallows the air whole. Tamsin Rowe had forgotten that. Or maybe she'd spent 4 years trying to forget everything. The weight of a vest, the way sand gets into teeth, the particular silence after a firefight when you count the ones still breathing. She'd traded all of it for a folding table at the back of a middle school library in Denton, Ohio, where the worst thing that happened on most days was a 6th grader returning a book 2 weeks late and lying about it. That was the arrangement. That was the plan. She shelved books in the mornings before the students arrived, running her fingers along the spines the way another woman might count rosary beads. Fiction, biography, science, history. She liked the order of it. She liked that nothing in a library required split-second decisions that determined whether someone's child came home. Her coworkers thought she was quiet. Her supervisor, a round-faced man named Mr. Drayling, who wore the same brown cardigan 3 days out of 5, had written on her 6-month evaluation, "Tamsin is reliable and unobtrusive." He'd meant it as a compliment. She'd accepted it as one. Nobody asked where she'd been before Denton. Nobody in a town like this one pressed too hard on the blank spaces in a resume if you showed up on time and didn't cause trouble. She'd said she traveled. She'd said family stuff. She'd said she needed something quieter for a while. All of it was true, in the way that a redacted document is still technically a document. The library occupied the east wing of Denton Middle School, a squat brick building that smelled permanently of institutional cleaner and cafeteria pizza. It shared a hallway with the main office and, during passing periods, flooded with the organized chaos of 411 to 14-year-olds who had somewhere else to be. Tamsin had learned their patterns the way she'd once learned patrol routes. Which kids moved fast and angry? Which ones lingered, looking for an excuse to be somewhere adults were present? Which ones came in during lunch to sit alone with a book and didn't want to be asked about it? She left those ones alone and kept the good ones within reach. That was the job nobody wrote in the evaluation. Principal Garrett Voss was the kind of administrator who had once, by his own account told at every staff meeting, turned a failing school around through sheer force of will and data-driven intervention. He referenced this turnaround the way some men referenced military service, with a reverence that suggested the experience had forged him into something the rest of them couldn't quite understand. He wore his authority like a pressed shirt, always buttoned to the top. He did not care for Tamsin. This was not personal, exactly. Voss didn't care for anything that didn't produce a measurable outcome. The library's circulation numbers had dropped since the district moved toward digital resources, and in his mind, this made Tamsin a redundancy dressed in a cardigan. He'd told her as much during her first formal review, not cruelly, but with the particular efficiency of a man who considered directness a virtue when it cost him nothing. "Your position may be consolidated at the end of the fiscal year," he'd said, clicking his pen. "I want to be transparent with you." "I appreciate that," Tamsin had said, and meant it less than she'd let on. The other staff had a read on Voss that they whispered in the break room. He wasn't malicious, just insulated. He'd risen far enough that the air up there was thin, and he'd stopped noticing. His assistant principal, a sharp-shouldered woman named Ms. Pruitt, did most of the actual management and got a fraction of the credit. The teachers knew it. Tamsin knew it. Voss almost certainly knew it too, and had organized his self-image around not examining it. Still, she showed up. Still, she shelved books and ran the reading incentive program for 6th graders, and fixed the self-checkout terminal that broke every other Thursday and helped kids find things they didn't have words for yet. That was the life she'd built out of the rubble of the other one, and she was careful with it. The morning it changed was an ordinary Tuesday in March, cold and flat-skied, the kind of day that doesn't announce itself. Tamsin had come in early to fix the display near the front entrance, a Black History Month installation that one of the overnight custodians had accidentally knocked askew. She was repositioning a framed photo of Bessie Coleman when she heard the first commotion from the main hallway. Not the loose, sprawling noise of students between classes. Something teeter. Something with an edge to it. She set down the frame. In her previous life, Tamsin had learned to read the acoustics of a building the way a doctor reads a heartbeat. For the rhythm, that doesn't belong. She'd done it in forward operating bases in places where wrong readings had consequences that couldn't be walked back. She wasn't supposed to need that skill here, in Denton, Ohio, in a library that smelled like old paper and the cherry air freshener Ms. Pruitt kept plugged into the outlet by the checkout desk. She needed it now. The noise resolved itself as she moved toward the door. A student was shouting, male, young, adolescent pitch, still finding its register. And the shouting had the particular quality of something that had tipped past the point of de-escalation. Not a fight over cafeteria territory. Not two boys posturing in front of witnesses. This was a voice with nowhere left to go. In the main hallway, Kyle Deering, 8th grade, 14 years old, whom Tamsin knew by sight and by the record she'd built in her head the way she'd built records on all of them. He came in twice a week, always to the graphic novel section, never asked for help, checked out his books, and left without making eye contact. Last 3 months, his attendance had dropped. His clothes had gotten less clean. There was a kind of quiet around him that wasn't peaceful. She'd flagged it mentally. She hadn't known to whom to pass the flag. He was standing in the middle of the hallway, with a pocket knife open in his right hand, not brandishing it exactly, just holding it while everything around him did what everything always did. Contracted, backed up, started making noise. 2 students had pressed flat against the lockers. A teacher, Mr. Zena from 7th grade social studies, was speaking to Kyle from a distance of about 10 feet with his hands visible, voice steady, which Tamsin noted with professional approval. Kyle wasn't listening. Kyle was somewhere else entirely. Voss emerged from the main office at the same moment Tamsin stepped out of the library. He took the scene in with the expression of a man whose data-driven systems did not have a column for this. For one beat, he was simply a person standing in a hallway, uncertain. That beat was long enough. Tamsin walked toward Kyle, not rushing, not showing the change in posture that would register as threat or prey. She'd been trained by people who'd spent decades studying the physiology of crisis, and one of the first things she'd learned was that a body moving with calm intention reads differently than any other kind of body in a room where panic is contagious. She kept her hands loose at her sides. She kept her face quiet. "Kyle," she said, not loud, just enough. He turned to look at her with eyes that had the flat, used-up quality she'd seen in places she tried not to think about. "You're not scared of me," he said. It came out confused, almost accusatory. "I don't think you want anyone to be scared of you," Tamsin said. "I think something happened and you ran out of ways to say it." Behind her, she was dimly aware of Voss. "Mrs. Rowe, step back." "She didn't step back. They called my mom," Kyle said. The knife hand dipped slightly. Not lowered, not yet, but the intention behind it had shifted. She didn't come. Tamsin moved closer by 2 steps. Close enough now that she could see his hand was shaking. Close enough that she could, if she needed to, control the situation in ways that nobody in this hallway, except Tamsin herself, would ever know she was capable of. She didn't need to. She hadn't needed to. She'd known that before she'd moved. "I know," she said. "That's a terrible thing to feel." She reached out her hand, palm up, and waited. Kyle looked at her hand for a long time. Then he closed the knife and put it in her palm. The sound of the hallway came back in all at once. Someone crying. Someone on a phone. Voss's voice behind her sharpened into something that had recalibrated into authority, now that the crisis was resolved and he needed to be seen as having managed it. Tamsin turned Kyle around by the shoulders and guided him toward the office, with a hand on his upper back. The knife already disappeared into her cardigan pocket, her face still carrying the expression of someone for whom none of this had been remarkable. That was the day the hallway remembered. But it wasn't the day everything changed. Everything changed 6 weeks later, on a Thursday. Thursdays were when the self-checkout terminal broke. Tamsin was on her knees behind the circulation desk with a screwdriver when she heard the main entrance doors. She knew immediately. It wasn't the sound. The doors opened the same way they always did, the same hydraulic exhalation. It wasn't any single thing she could have named in a police report. It was a composite of signals too small to be individually legible that she had been trained for years to read as a gestalt. The quality of pause before the footfall, the number of them, the distribution of weight. Three adults, moving with the deliberate non-urgency of people who'd practiced looking casual. She stayed on her knees. She listened. The first voice was the one she was almost certain she would hear, looking for the main office. The student aide at the front desk, a seventh grader named Poppy who took the job seriously, said, "Just down the hall to the left. Appreciate it." The footsteps moved away. Tamsin set down the screwdriver and rose. She went to the library's small office in the back, a room with a window that looked out onto the parking lot, and stood to one side of the glass and looked. 3 vehicles. 2 of them were the kind of nondescript domestic sedans that had been fleet vehicles or rentals, so long they'd achieved pure vehicular anonymity. The third was an older pickup with Colorado plates and a parking decal for a storage facility outside Colorado Springs that Tamsin recognized, specifically and immediately, because she had helped choose it. She stood very still for a moment. Then she went to Pruett's desk and asked calmly whether anyone had contacted the office about visitors that morning. Ms. Pruett, who was eating a yogurt and reviewing attendance reports, looked up. "No walk-ins that I know of." "Why?" "I thought I recognized someone in the lot," Tamsin said. "Probably nothing." She went back to the library. She did not go back to the screwdriver. What she knew about the men in that hallway could not be contained in the kind of file a middle school librarian in Denton, Ohio would have any reason to possess. She knew that the first voice had belonged to a man named Beckett Crane, who had recruited her out of a ROTC program at the University of Michigan when she was 22 years old and had a near-perfect rifle qualification score, and a psychology minor that had interested him. He'd explained to her over the course of 18 months of the most demanding training she had ever experienced. She knew that Beckett had an old shoulder injury that caused him to lead with his right when he was tired, and that he was never tired where anyone could see it, so she looked for other things. She knew that he kept his word with a precision that was itself a kind of weapon, and that he only came in person when the thing he needed to say could not be said through any other channel. She knew that if Beckett Crane was in the parking lot of Denton Middle School on a Thursday morning, it was not social. She had left that life cleanly, or she'd believed she had. 4 years of remaking herself incrementally. The town, the job, the rhythms of a life in which the highest stakes decision most days was whether to recommend Hatchet or My Side of the Mountain to a particular kind of 10-year-old reader. She hadn't been hiding, exactly. She'd simply removed herself from a context in which she was useful in ways she was no longer willing to be useful. And nobody had come after her, and she'd started, slowly, carefully, to believe that the distance was real. Beckett Crane in the parking lot meant the distance had a limit. She straightened the display near the door that didn't need straightening. She helped a 6th grader find a book about birds. She fixed the self-checkout terminal. She did all of it with the particular focus of a woman who has learned that the most effective way to manage fear is to keep your hands occupied and your face neutral. At 11:42, Voss himself appeared in the library doorway. She looked up from the terminal. "Mrs. Rowe," he said. "A moment." They had asked Voss to provide a space and to keep it brief and discreet, which told Tamsin they were being careful about how this looked. Voss had given them the small conference room off the main office, which was used for parent-teacher meetings, and smelled like the same institutional cleaner as the rest of the building, but was slightly more aspirationally furnished. There were 3 of them. Beckett, seated. To his left, a woman Tamsin knew as Agent Solace, who ran logistics for a team that technically didn't have a name and practically was referred to only by its mission classification. To Beckett's right, a man she didn't know, young, late 20s, who had the posture of someone recently graduated from a program very much like the one Tamsin had completed. Voss excused himself immediately. Tamsin suspected Beckett had said one very precise thing to make that happen. She sat. "You look good," Beckett said. "You could have called," she said. "We tried the number we had." "I changed it." "We know," said Solace. There was no judgment in it, simply acknowledgement. Tamsin looked at Beckett. "What happened?" He set a photograph on the table. She recognized it, a logistics hub outside of Matagalpa, Nicaragua, a place she'd been twice. The photograph showed what remained of it. 3 weeks ago, Beckett said, 4 people, The team we ran in after you left. They were doing infrastructure assessment, low profile, nothing that should have generated this response. Tamsin looked at the photograph without picking it up. Who knew they were there? That's the question. And you're here because the operational brief for that mission was built on a framework you designed. We need to know if there's anything in that framework that could have been read if someone knew how to read it as a location indicator. He paused. Not an accusation, a consultation. She'd known that. She'd known it the moment she'd seen the pickup with the Colorado plates. She'd spent the walk from the library to this conference room making herself know it fully, and then setting it down so she could be useful. Walk me through the timeline, she said. What followed was 2 hours and 40 minutes of the most intensive work she'd done since she'd left, and it happened in a conference room where a parent-teacher meeting about long division had occurred the previous afternoon between a woman who'd spent 4 years trying to retire her own expertise and 3 people who'd come a long way to borrow it. She'd designed the framework they were asking about as a junior analyst, 24 years old, working on a problem of how to structure operational communication in environments with unreliable technology and compromised local contacts. The solution she'd built was elegant in the specific way that useful things are elegant. Not because it was complicated, but because it was simple in ways that were non-obvious to anyone who hadn't approached the problem from precisely her angle. It had been in use for 6 years. It had worked for 6 years because the thing about a good framework is that it accounts for the ways that people try to break it. Someone had found a way to break it. She worked through it methodically, the way she shelved books, systematically, without sentiment, running her hands along the architecture she'd built until she found the place where it had failed. Beckett asked precise questions. Solis took notes with her left hand and tracked Tamsin's face with the kind of attention that was itself a form of documentation. The young man whose name she'd learned was Aldrich Ewan asked the question that turned out to be the right one, which made her revise upward her assessment of him. If someone had access to the communications log but not the key, Aldrich said, would the location pattern still be derivable from frequency alone? She stopped. She looked at the framework she'd drawn on the legal pad they'd given her. Yes, she said, if they ran it through the right filter, if they knew to look for interval clustering rather than content. She tapped the pad. This node. 14 months ago, there was I flagged it as a transmission irregularity. I noted it in the maintenance logs as a potential equipment issue. It's in the maintenance log, Solis said, not a question. The maintenance log would have been accessible to anyone who audited the facility, Tamsin said. Beckett was very still the way he got when something mattered. Can you tell us what to look for? He asked. In the audit records, specifically. She spent the next 40 minutes writing it out in the precise, unornamental language she'd been trained to use. The language she'd spent 4 years trying to forget, which came back to her with a fluency that was both reassuring and quietly devastating. It was like riding a bicycle if the bicycle had once saved your life and you'd put it in a shed and told yourself you didn't need it anymore. She still knew how to ride. When she was done, she capped the pen and set it on the table and looked at Beckett. That should be enough, she said. It's more than enough, he said. It always was. There was a quality in the room then, something that wasn't quite sentiment and wasn't quite relief, but was some third thing that existed in the specific overlap between people who had been through something together and had arrived, years later, on the other side of it still more or less intact. How's the library? Beckett asked. It was such an unexpected question that it almost made her laugh, which would have been the first time she'd laughed in a conference room since she'd left. The self-checkout terminal breaks every other Thursday, she said. He almost smiled. Sounds manageable. The school day had continued around them. Oblivious. Tamsin was aware of it the way you're aware of weather, outside a window, present, textured, not her immediate concern. When she left the conference room at 2:17 in the afternoon, the hallways were moving with students in the post-lunch flow, and someone had taped a flyer about the spring band concert to every available vertical surface, and the smell of institutional cleaner had been temporarily overcome by whatever was being served in the cafeteria. She walked back to the library. Poppy was at the front desk, resolving returns. A cluster of 8th graders was occupying the study tables near the window, performing the simulation of homework while primarily looking at each other. One of the 6th graders from the reading incentive program was waiting at the counter with a book he'd clearly already finished and a poorly concealed hope that she'd let him check out too. She let him check out too. Voss appeared in the doorway at 3:45. After the last student had gone, she had expected him. She'd spent the intervening time doing the things the job required and thinking, in the organized way she'd trained herself to think about what she was going to say when he appeared. Because Voss was going to want to understand what he'd facilitated, and he was going to want to position himself in relation to it, and she was going to have to manage that without lying, and without saying anything that the people she'd just spent 2 hours with would have objected to her saying. "I have to ask," Voss said, from the doorway, with the tone of a man asserting the right to ask as his preamble to the asking. "You can ask," she said. She was straightening the display again. She seemed to do a lot of thinking while straightening displays. They weren't personal contacts of yours." "No," she said. "They came here specifically." "Yes." He turned his pen over in his hand. She'd noticed he did this when he was recalibrating. "Your file, when you were hired, you didn't list." "My file is accurate," she said. "What I did before doesn't have a category that fits neatly on an employment form." She turned to look at him directly. "I'm aware that's not entirely satisfying." Voss studied her for a moment with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. It wasn't the assessing look he wore when he was running numbers on her position's cost-effectiveness. It was something less rehearsed than that. "The situation in the hallway," he said, "with Kyle Deering, 6 weeks ago. Yes, you weren't. That wasn't." He stopped, started again. Most people would have waited. "I know," she said. "I told you to step back. You did. I'd been told, in the training we did on de-escalation, that untrained staff should always." "That's the right policy," Tamsin said. "For untrained staff." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, a late bus was pulling out of the lot. Someone's sneakers were squeaking on the hallway floor, running for it. "I owe you an apology," Voss said finally, "for what I said in your review about consolidation." She looked at him. "That's not." "I was looking at numbers," he said. "I wasn't looking at what the numbers don't count." Tamsin considered this. It was a more honest thing than she'd expected from him, and she had an instinct, developed over many years of evaluating people in high-stakes circumstances, that it had cost him something to say it. "I appreciate that," she said, and this time she meant it. The next morning, she arrived early again. She repositioned the Bessie Coleman photographs that had never quite recovered from the custodian's accident. She started the coffee in the break room because no one else ever did. She fixed the self-checkout terminal that had, on schedule, broken again overnight. Poppy came in at 7:30 and said, "Good morning, Mrs. Rowe," and went to the front desk without being asked. 2 6th graders arrived before first bell, which happened sometimes, the ones who found something in the library that they couldn't find at home yet, and came here first. Tamsin let them in and went back to her work. She thought about Beckett's question. "How's the library?" She thought about the way she'd answered it. The self-checkout terminal, the Thursdays, the ordinary texture of a job that mattered in ways that weren't legible to anyone running the numbers. She thought about the 2 hours in that conference room and how completely and fluently she'd moved back into the person she'd been before. The one who could find the break in a framework that 6 years of operational use hadn't surfaced. The one whose brain still mapped instinctively to threat and pattern, and the specific geometry of what could go wrong. She didn't know what to do with that, exactly. She knew she was staying. That part was settled, had been settled before she'd walked out of the conference room. This was the life she'd built, and she'd built it deliberately, and it held things she hadn't expected. Poppy taking the front desk job seriously, the 6th graders, who came before first bell, Kyle Deering, who had put a knife in her palm, and whom she intended to keep an eye on for the rest of the school year. But she also knew, now, that the distance she'd believed in wasn't the kind you could actually live in. The other self wasn't gone. It was just shelved, the way you shelved a book you'd read completely and knew chapter and verse and couldn't pretend you didn't. She was both of those people. She always had been. At 7:58, the first warning bell rang, and the hallways started filling with the sound of 400 kids who had somewhere to be, and Tamsin Rowe opened the library doors and stood behind the circulation desk and waited for whoever needed something she had. She was good at this job. She was good at the other one, too. That was, it turned out, the whole story, and also the beginning of it.